seen this and as a way to categorize your projects. So this is where collections is. Very important and a very high priority. Collections are why pretty much we all have jobs. Collection management systems is how we manage the stuff we have that gives us those jobs. Who makes collections management systems? That means vendors are in this top right corner as well. This is not a bitching session, even though there are a list of things that we would love our collections management system to do. We are going to have a conversation. We're going to give the vendors some insight in the kinds of things that we have seen in our survey, the kinds of things of where collections management is going. But we have a larger problem to solve. Like I said, this was highlighted earlier on to a session where vendors were called out, excluded from the conversation. That should not be happening. So vendors, maybe the vendors on one side, museums on the other. Totally kidding. Okay, so I'm going to give you a really high-level view of this, the study that we performed. There are some big findings in there, some insight into digitization, collections online, access and integration, selection process, strategy, and some broader themes, and then we're going to get into a larger conversation. The details of this are at the end of that bit.ly link, so I'm going to go through this really quickly. But hopefully you'll be able to position yourself in the context of all these things happening. So digitization. The thing to notice about this is the blue stuff is institutions that have no analog, all digital representation of their collection objects. An important thing. So 3/4 of respondents are digitizing less than 1,000 objects a year. Almost all are shooting or reshooting from the original. Half have what I would regard as an unmanaged digital asset environment, so no managed system to manage those digital assets. Looking at all the data, it looks like collections increase in size by about 1% a year. Cataloging and digitization rates are about 1.5% a year. We are not spending down the principal of our collections capital. There are about 35,000 museums in the US. This study represents just over 0.5% of what we found, and this study represents, in the blue, 9.3 million objects, which, if it only took an hour to digitize and catalog, would take 4.5 millennia to get through. The other thing you should know is that 2/3 of respondents said they wanted to digitize everything, eventually. What a beautifully optimistic field we all work in. Collections online. 1/10 of respondents have 100% of their collections online. 1/2 of respondents have less than 10% of their collections online. 3/4 of respondents have less than 20% of their collection on view. 2/3 of respondents have less than 10% of their objects with educational or interpretive copy. 40%, those who have collections online, are leveraging the CMS's online module to do it. 2/3 use have either highlights or use social media to get to provide access to the public to their collections from a digital surrogate. A couple of comments. Is this you about getting your collections online? We thought this would be done years ago. We'd like to, but no plan yet. Discussed often, but no plan of what or when. We have a broken promise of what digital was going to give us in addressing access to collections, broadly speaking. Access and integration, so providing access to our collections online. Mostly done by low resolution and thumbnails. 7% though are providing unrestricted kind of open access. This was a larger number than I thought, including commercial use. 40% of institutions have less than 10% of records with metadata for access. There is broad authority control adopted by respondents. It's dominated by the Getty vocabularies. 90% of respondents have their collections management system on-prem. Public access and discovery is still a work in progress. I think that's obvious. In terms of integration, web content management is the priority for institutions, with DAMs and even preservation systems surprising to me as a requirement for integration. The bus arrived. Come in. Museums on the left, vendors on the right. Sorry, good job. Selection. Selection of the most crucial application that a museum has. So what staff are involved? Mostly collections and curatorial staff, but half the staff who are involved in the selection of the collections management of the respondents we talked to have now left. I wanted to distinguish between participation and leading the initiative to select. Mostly led by collections, but staff, again, a high percentage of staff who have now left. Final decision, a third, not sure, kind of obvious with people not knowing, those people not being there anymore, but a quarter was leadership and a quarter was given to collections staff. Only 1/4 followed any kind of formal process to make their selection. I'll say that again, because this is probably the most significant thing that came out of the study for me. Only 1/4 followed a formal process. Mostly it was by peer recommendation, prior familiarity, or other informal sources. Half the staff involved in the selection had departed. That's a big issue if you are not doing a formal process to align your institutional requirements with a software product. So there we have it. Not surprising that there is frustration with incumbent systems. And I should point out that most people who have an issue tend to fill in a survey. Oftentimes people who are fantastically happy with whatever they have are unlikely to do a survey. Strategy. So this is a strategic roadmap in place for collections. 50% had a broad collections management institutional goal. Wasn't really documented, but was just kind of understood by the institution. 40% had specific goals, but unassigned resources. 16% had specific goals and a genuinely resourced plan for the most important thing that we exist for. 2/3 have managed collections electronically for 15 years. A half have had the same collections management system for 10 years or more. We saw a serious disconnect between collections management strategy and the ability or commitment of an institution to deliver it. These are some kind of broad themes. I'm just going to kind of mention these because these are going to kind of tee up the conversation that we're going to have. Museums want their CMS to be more than just a CMS. They want it to be this highly functioning tool. The extent to which the collections management system is being used as a productivity and workflow tool and the amount of staff whose work it is controlling was a real surprise to me. Pretty much every department is affected by the reports that are coming out of the collections management system. And oftentimes, reports are not as valued as much by the vendors as they should be. About half would like to replace their CMS at some point. Many of them struggle to make the case. This is oftentimes there is not a receptive leadership in place to kind of accept that case that they're trying to make. And this was a kind of a constant. The pain of using the tool is perceived to be less than the pain of switching and all the migration effort that would need to be involved in doing that switch. A number of institutions, a number of respondents, quite a number of respondents, framed it like this. We kind of feel like we're in a hot situation. We want to use this thing as a tool. We want to really easily get stuff in and out. And that's not to say you can't get stuff in and out, but there is technical requirement, there is a fair amount of resources needed to actually do it. And there is a perception that the vendors are reluctant to provide that ease of functionality because it may make it easier to switch, which is a complete irony. The one thing that the users want is perceived to be the one thing that the vendors don't want to make really easy for. Maybe we have a Stockholm situation. Okay, so my esteemed colleagues, we all sat down and said, okay, here are some questions that we think are really important. There's no way we're going to get through all of these, and frankly, this really needs to be the start of a much broader and meaningful conversation between museums and their requirements for collections management and all the vendors who provide that service. So here are some of the discussions. So I'll kind of give you a heads up. A lot of institutions go to their website first to find collections management information, and then go into their collections management system. Is that true for anyone? One person, okay. Two people.
In certain cases.
Okay, caveat in certain cases. I don't know whether this is true. Is the frustration increasing or decreasing and rooted in a problem that museums are creating? If we don't do an RFP, the product may be not the best fit, so it's not surprising that there's frustration with it. Do we have a trust issue? Trust issue on both sides of our ability, a museum's ability to effectively communicate what their scope and requirements are? And do museums think that the vendors are responding appropriately to that? Do vendors create the functionality we ask for? Are we clear about what we need? Access is a core requirement for us, but appears to be an add-on for the vendor's perspective. So do you want to get this online? There is an online module. It's a separate thing. Old staff know how to work the system. New staff ask why we would put up with it. That's more of a statement. I see a couple of nods and smiles there. We have interest in how the vendor making product functionality decisions. And this struck us as being maybe a disconnect. Museums live in a highly collaborative environment. Vendors necessarily live in a competitive environment. Is that a conflict? So, lots of really thought-provoking questions. And I'm going to throw it open to any person on this panel who would like to start any one of those things that they think is most important. Actually, should we poll the crowd to see who thinks is most important?
Yeah.
Poll the crowd. So, anybody want to shout out a number that they think is very crucial to what the situation that they are in is?
Number one.
Number one, okay.
Number 8.
Yeah,
Number 8, that was a couple of yeses.
number 7.
Number 7.
Number 9.
Number 9. Okay, it's not getting us anywhere. Okay. Of those 5, 1, 7, 8, 9. Anybody on the panel? Because I could just talk all afternoon.
I think that's number 1.
Okay.
I think that's number 1. Do I need a mic?
Yes.
So we did an internal TMS satisfaction survey earlier this year. It was very, very enlightening. And the biggest, one of our most common comments was we go to the online collection is easier to search than TMS. It's because they have a Google type search. We have obviously our online collection is a Google type search. So that's one of the biggest complaints of our collections management system is there's no Google type search. It's not intuitive. You have to know which field something is you're searching in. So that's why a lot of our staff will go to the online collection before going to the collections management system. Very common at our museum.
And do you have Google search implemented on your website?
Well, it's a general keyword search. It's not technically
Okay.
a Google search, but it's a general keyword search. It's fast. So, and they're usually just looking up basic information. Obviously, they can't use it if they want to find loan information or exhibition history or shipping information, but it's generally the basic information, all the dégâts, or a specific, even just a specific session number. It's very common for them to go to the website.
So for me, here's what's going on. So you have a website that is designed for access, and you have a system that is designed for collections management. Is that a disconnect? Is that one of our challenges? I think it came out in the, certainly this whole issue of getting collections online and the challenge of doing that. I mean, is this what's going
Another
on?
comment from our survey was our collections management system is not intuitive and it's very difficult to search. So they sort of give up and go to the website instead. And we try to, offer more training and things like that, but there's only so much we can do with search capabilities.
Since I have it, can I? Okay. I'm going to throw out, it's connected. I'm going to throw out something that may be like a dreamy thing that we're looking for, and I think in some respects maybe the public-facing interfaces may get us closer to that. So the dreamy thing is, wouldn't it be cool to have a collections management system that enlivens our experiences with the art and also with people and information? So I think we might be going to our public-facing interfaces because they may offer a little bit more, you would call it a dreamy experience, but maybe it's more toward enlivening experiences. And I think I get a little frustrated personally with, for sure we want to create a really engaging experience for our audience, but staff often is left with something that's not that dreamy and not that enlivening. So that's one thing I would say about why we might go to the website.
While you're changing that over, does our findings, do they resonate with you? Do I get a validation with what's going on? Would you like to say something?
So, yes, that's definitely the experience of people that use this.
That's the experience of people that use the system I use. And generally, the answer we get is it's resource issues. That we're using this system where we're keeping very detailed and sometimes technical information, and trying to search that through a Google type interface is not easy. So from a programming perspective, and the amount of required computing makes it more difficult. And so that in some ways, if we want that deep information, we have to sacrifice the dreamy.
I don't know if that's true, but.
Yes, probably this is.
Let me just say one thing. Let's keep out vendor names out of it. If you're a museum and you're talking about, can you refer to it as a system rather than a product name? Just so it's kind of, because we're trying to get at some generic issues here.
So I think this part of the discussion is already where the disconnect between expectations of the museums and what they get when they buy a system starts. Because a collection management system is a very professional tool. It requires training. And at the same time, you say, okay, the staff just like to use the Google search and get a meaningful result at the same time. So I don't say that it's not impossible to do this in a collection management system at all. But this is one of your requirements. Another requirement is at the same time you want to do super complex, high-end searches with lots of different criteria and operators and bracketing and whatnot. So the vendors are always in this position, okay, you want to do the easy thing and the super complex, complicated thing at the same time. And that's a challenge, to be honest.
Perfect. That's exactly why we're here.
We have other enterprise systems that have Google searches, our finance system, our task management system, our digital asset management system. So when staff see this functionality in other tools they use every day, that's why they go to our website to search the collection.
Yeah, and I would think it's not necessarily, at least from the user perspective, not that there would be one canonical sort of search affordance, but that these would be parallel options, much as in a public-facing web environment for some collections resource, there'd be the Google-like box, there'd be the more advanced search that would be field restricted and complex and all of that, and that if these things can be offered side by side, there's more value there.
Yeah, I would say two things. One is certainly the rise of good-looking consumer-facing web-based applications makes us all appreciate ease of use in a way that maybe hasn't been appreciated in the past. And I would say too, my second point, expert searchers appreciate a great user interface just as much as a novice searcher.
And I'd also just add to that, I think there are, even for expert searchers, certainly back office collections related use cases wherein the searcher does not know necessarily where something will be. It may be a more exploratory kind of discovery, where in any field for some of our holdings does this term appear, to tie things together in ways that may be about where information was entered or not, or maybe about discovering connections across objects that don't share a creator, but maybe that creator name pops up in different fields across other records, and these kinds of serendipitous discovery can be enabled, even for people who know the collection well.
Julia, do you want to say? And I should mention that Julia played a significant part in the study when she was at BPOC.
Sure, so I was going to echo what Chad said. One of the comments that we got that was more memorable was about how these were older style, a lot of times legacy systems created before usability became a large factor. And sometimes that comes from the product, but a lot of times that comes from museums not resourcing the product and are several versions behind, which just kind of piles up and builds on that problem.
We have a question from the audience.
I was just gonna quick kind of jump off of what everyone else was saying with a theory that I might have, which is I wonder if part of this comes from the fact that these systems tend to need and require that we put in our own specific search terms for objects and things, whereas Google is much more freeform in that way. You can put in kind of whatever term and eventually get to what you're looking for in a way that these collection systems generally can't allow for because they need the parameters that you use to set up. And so I wonder if maybe the difference in actual just lexicon that people use for searching might actually cause some of the issues here.
We should remember that Google is the largest company on the planet and has invested a huge amount in their search.
I think too, I know at a lot of institutions, the collections management systems, they're only available when you're on site. And so a lot of our staff who work from home, curators, our marketing department, the website is accessible 24/7 no matter where they are. So I think now with more web-based CMSs coming into the field, it'll be interesting to see if there's a shift in user access to that and searching there too.
We get a lot of requests for mobile access, especially our staff travel, they go on courier trips, they have to do condition checks, and they can't really VPN into their desktop, it's not convenient. So if we had a mobile collections management system, or even responsive, that would be really helpful.
I mean, just quickly, you reminded me, hopefully I don't repeat what you just said, but I know our conservators go into a situation when they are a courier, and it's almost like, here comes SF MoMA, and we're carrying paper, and it's kind of, a little bit of shame. And so it ties into with workarounds, and going to the web as maybe one workaround, or we hear about our staff needing to pull the data out to do some data analysis, that some of the analysis that we think could conceivably be done within a system, should it be fill in the blank. But I think we're seeing a number of workarounds kind of pile on top of each other, going to the web for searching, using paper wouldn't it be cool to be able to, be live with your system?
And I would just note there'd also be some interesting security model questions around that. What sorts of things can be accessed anywhere from?
Which seems really addressable.
Yeah, oh yeah.
So we're talking about some really complex requirements. So question, I guess question 5, are we, vendors, are we clear about our requirements?
No, but back to the requirements we just heard now. Google search, nice interface, complex functionality, available through the web, available location independent. There is like at least a dozen of systems out there which do all that already. So we heard you, we did all that. But still, I mean, there's a lot of other areas where it's not always so clear what's asked for or what's needed.
For me, what was really interesting, it's not even on this list, but that perception that the pain of switching systems is more painful than putting up with a crummy tool kind of gets at, it's been a good 10, 15 years. So how long are you expected to suffer? I don't know, this is the question.
Oh, just just quickly, just in response, not to Marcia, sorry, I think I'll just speak very personally, I would love to engage with a vendor who's super excited about our ideas. And just work with us towards, having a meaningful conversation, and so we both arrive at an understanding. But I think that's what, I would love the vendors to be excited to work with us, and I want to be excited to work with the vendor. It's equal, yeah.
And if I can tag onto that, I think that excitement is something that actually I have quite, well, not frequently, but routinely, point to point with the person at our vendor who I typically interact with the most. And that person and I share a lot of enthusiasm for particular capabilities that both of us see great value in. And I think one of the underlying factors here, and the people in the room who work for firms that develop these systems would know far more than I wonder if part of this is that enthusiasm is the sort of surface thing that's very essential, but enthusiasm doesn't get functionalities built out and delivered. It takes serious development resources to do some of those things, and I would guess that our museum community, large as it seems to us, especially when we're here in rooms full of people at MCN, I mean, we're a pretty small, highly targeted, boutique-y market with highly complex needs that differ across each installation for the most part. And I can only imagine, and I'm not a vendor so I can say this out loud, that the total revenue side for what all of us pay all of our vendors in annual maintenance and support, how that translates into some aggregate total of development capability can only match up for scale in a way that makes very well targeted, thought through, communicated priorities for what we value most across the field extremely valuable, because otherwise I would bet that with those limited development resources to hear about 30 or 40 different things that different clients want, I mean, what gets built out? What gets added to a punch list and sits there for a while because it's not clear that the field as a whole sees that as a priority? So just to open that can of worms.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that real quick, I see real opportunity in museums being clear about ideas and opportunities that we see. I love it when Layna says, wouldn't it be great if? Could you imagine a time when? Things like that, so that we could have this sort of energetic, excited conversation with vendors who know the space better than anyone, and are aware of the opportunities and can join in that excitement. If museums aren't clear about that, we're not going to have the systems we want in 10 years.
I just want to respond to you, Rob. I feel like pretty strongly that it's more a situation of all of these independent and uniquely identified needs are really a matter of semantics. People want the same thing, but they call it something different, and there's not a clearinghouse for translation that allows it to aggregate up to really 5 different things we all need. And when you evaluate like grants coming through IMLS and you see the amount of money the government is spending to get people into new systems, and it's just because they're constantly dissatisfied, there's enough resource there to solve this problem.
Yeah, and I agree with that in a slightly flip sense, which is to say, if we find a way as a community towards some sort of collaborative identification and critically around this notion of things being expressed differently while it's still the same core functionality that's needed, some clustering of these differently expressed needs that are more shared than we realize at first, whether this is some sort of, upvote, downvote platform that floats stuff up and allows some clustering of topics and further floating up or down. I think yeah, there are definitely ways to make that work. I think the inhibiting factor in the current sort of social scenario of our world is that there's not a great mechanism to do that clustering of quite similar needs and then that collaborative prioritization of which of those clustered clumps of needs are actually most important to the field writ large.
One of our vendors has a really a portal that you can submit requests and people can vote, and it's all transparent, and it would be great if our collections management system had that. It's very useful to see what other people are asking for, and maybe we've solved that, and, you know, can chime in, but the transparency and be able to vote. I mean, if we submit something, you know, our colleagues put something out on Slack and they say, can you please vote on this? So we all stack the ballots. But it's just useful to see what people are asking for. I'm sure it's helpful to the vendor to also see.
The search functionality question is interesting for me, coming from a small institution where the online collection was less than 10%, so staff who were untrained in the CMS were unable to go to the website to do what they needed, and then collections staff became tasked with having to help pretty much any other staff member untrained in the system to find what they needed. So my question is about training and what your experience is training collection staff, but also the larger staff, particularly at institutions that would need curators and other people to be kind of well-versed in the system to be able to use it. And if this training is really closely aligned with your vendors or how you go about doing that.
We have a full-time trainer, so we do all our training. We don't go through the vendor, and they also do user support. They usually will go to the person's desk and do a lot of hand-holding, but training is very important. But we get a lot of staff turnover, so we have to train again. We do have written documentation. People tend not to read written documentation. It's much easier for someone to call. But we do as much training as we can. We take it pretty seriously.
I think training is a massive problem, and compared with aligned with staff turnover. So, and this is the vendors in the room, and it's not just the collections management vendors, it's all the vendors who have this immense frustration with bringing in a system, working with either one individual or a group of individuals, training up that team, and then, you know, over the course of a year, those people have gone. The museum can't afford to bring in training again, and so you have this degradation of ability to use the system.
Yeah, we're an interesting sort of other end of the continuum, I think, from the Met. In a museum with 3 staff people, count them, 3. In our case, there's one staff person who is pretty well conversant with the sorts of things that the staff as a whole need to do in the system. That person serves as an ad hoc on the fly resource for the 2 colleagues who are less conversant with the system and whose interactions with it tend to be more immediately use case driven and suddenly need to do something, but don't use it often enough that even if they did have some moment of a few days of deeper, more general knowledge, they wouldn't necessarily retain it because they might go 2 years before they have to apply it. Along with that, we have just a small number of in-house how to do it step-by-step sheets for the most frequently encountered tasks, how to print out a polling list to remove things from storage, that kind of thing, but it tends to be more informal and on the fly.
I can see that Kevin has a question, but if you would just indulge me, Kevin. So one of the things I can say is that SF MoMA is in the final leg of hunting for a new collections management system. So one of the exercises that we did with our staff, we called it a barometer exercise, and we were really looking to understand how much it's costing in staff time in terms of using the current system. And so we gave them this spectrum. So we asked them to rate the time you spend working with or around our current system. So blue meant, you know, it's very peaceful, it's really reasonable, not a problem. Yellow was, it's annoying, it's starting to get in the way, and red, it's really frustrating, it's a big problem. And I mention this because it has to do with training, and also has to do with number 7, old staff. So by that I mean people that have been there for a long time, not necessarily age-wise, but anyway, what we found was on this barometer, the people that had been using the system the most, and that were the most trained in it, I guess, over time, it's like, with one hand tied behind my back, it's reasonable because they knew how to navigate the system, whereas new staff, however old or young they were like the hair on fire. It is really a big problem. So just to point that out in terms of the training and the more you kind of use it. But now off to Kevin.
Yeah, I was just going to say, to sort of reiterate the transparency piece from the vendors, there are a lot of business systems out there that have
between user groups and online documentation that shows here's what our roadmap is, here's what we're working on. So I would say challenge the vendors to show that to you. What's in your planning process, what are you moving to? But I think also the other piece lies on us as the museum folks to make sure we've got things documented well. You know, again, looking at the turnover of staff, do we have the documentation in place that explains what we've been doing that carries us forward? So if you are looking at a new system or even talking to a vendor about a change, you can present to them, you know, here's how we do this and this is why. I think the other thing that we have as an industry is that we all think we're unique and we do things differently. But I think there's more similarities between what we're doing than we think, and we need to use that to our advantage.
So I have a confession to make before I hand it over, and I would like to talk a little bit about product functionality decisions and hear from the vendors. Some time ago, I got a strategic consulting gig with an institution, and I literally took the previous report that I had written for another institution and showed it to them as a draft. They said, I can't believe how well you've understood our institution. Because, and I really say that to illustrate, we do all have the same problems, and I loved your comment and a couple of comments here about we kind of have all have the same challenges and issues, even though we talk about it differently. So the solution is to figure out how we work better together. So I would like to ask one of the vendors, can you comment on the product functionality decisions and how you're making those decisions? Daniel.
Probably shouldn't step into this, but
You want to say it. We're glad you are.
Right.
That's why you're here.
So just to take a step back, you said a couple of things which, because you say them in that beautiful accent, we all just assume it's correct. But I want to at least put out my refutation of it. So you said that you felt that users in the museum community were collaborative, but the vendors were competitive. That has not been my experience. We, at my company, try to be very collaborative. We have meetings, we talk to people, we elicit comments. Everything in all of our systems is only there because people have asked for it. On the other hand, I don't see as much competition among vendors as you might see. I mean, we all know what collection management systems do. You know, it's like cars. You know, this is how a car works. Knock yourself out, build a car. Elon Musk, oh, that looks pretty easy. I should be able to do that. You know, it's not like we're hoarding some kind of market, you know, secret that differentiates us. We're all working in the same space. So I do not see the same level of competition nor the same lack of collaboration that you mentioned. That being said, what was the question?
Productivity decisions, number 8.
Oh yeah, so you know, we have a product roadmap, we have a user conference, we have a vote up, vote down thing, which we initiated recently, actually after speaking to Jennie. So, and the very fact that we initiated it after speaking to Jennie shows that we must be listening. Like I tell everyone, we don't have an R&D department. Everything comes from the grassroots.
I just say my comment wasn't about you being collaborative with us. My comment was that you guys live in this competitive world, so from our perception, maybe there's competition going on.
Sounds better when you say it.
Julia.
No, I wanted to jump in on some of the kind of feature request conversations that have been going on, and also on the training, but it comes back to some of the survey findings that say that there aren't a lot of strategy documents in place around collections management, and there aren't a lot of formal RFP processes going on. I think another way to create a common language around some of these features that we're all looking for is to have some of those documents that say, here's what we really need, and maybe to share those with others in the community so that we are all looking at the same things.
So SFMOMA just has been circulating a request for information, and if anyone would like a copy of it, we're more than happy to send it out. I don't know whether, okay, I see a hand raised, so Oh, maybe it's just a question. I don't know whether it's a request for the request, but,
Request or
Michael-
question?
There you go.
Well, it's a sort of comment really, just to say, we're also just coming to the end of the same process for the Ashmolean, so art and archaeology. We've been through a very formal and intensive process, so we have lots of stuff. So if people are interested, then we can share that.
So then it becomes.
Another
where-
fabulous accent.
There you go. Where do we put the stuff? I mean, is there a common place?
So
I know-
that is a fabulously
Oh, yeah.
set up for the next slide.
Yes, taking up the common place to look for, if you're in a decision process, maybe I can pass on some useful information from Europe. Some of you might have heard about Collections Trust, which formerly was the Museum Documentation Association in the UK. They developed Spectrum, a documentation standard and best practice guide, and they do an official certification process for collection management software being Spectrum compliant. So in Europe, it's basically standard by now. If you receive an RFP, the first thing is there's a mandatory requirement that your system must be Spectrum certified. And that's a good thing because it saves you another 100 questions, because through the certification you can be sure that like basic collection management functionality is there anyway. So this would be probably for a number of North American museums a useful read.
Those Brits are gonna love them. Thank you. So I'm really surprised that we're having this conversation in the year 2018. I was expecting this probably 15, 20 years ago. I got really surprised that the CMS that we're using at our museum looks like from the 90s. And you know, all of that is truth for the experience we have. And I'm supposed to be the guru, and I am not, for the CMS. And it's a struggle that we shouldn't have at this point. So I'm wondering, because we have to make decisions, will it be possible to put up something like a consumer report for CMS, where we can share all our experiences and gather all the information so we can choose wisely in the present and the future?
So again, another fantastically staged person in the crowd. So that's exactly why we're here. We've got to start figuring this out.
So, this is may seem like an unrelated question, but at the beginning, all the survey information you had, how many natural history museums were included in that?
There was about 10, between 10 and 15.
So, because I kind of feel like, this is the way I feel at AAM too, like I'm the odd man out, like I'm the natural history person talking to the art people, but he's totally right, we have the exact same issues, and we need the exact same things, and I don't know how we figure out how to make sure that we get all kinds of museums involved in the conversation, but I do think that's important.
Okay, so I'm from, I'm allowed to say where I'm from, right?
Sure.
I'm from the Canadian Heritage Information Network. And we used to do an extensive review of collections management systems. That didn't happen for several years for many reasons. We did take up the project again of getting some information that we thought would be useful for museums. We do have a tool, a checklist for requirements, although it's intended that people go through and select their specific requirements instead of just taking the whole thing. In the last year, we developed a document, and some of the people in the room may give any comments on it, on developing an RFP for collections management system. And we did a limited number of profiles and evaluations of some systems. We're reviewing the process that we did because we had limitations of time and the functionalities that we ask, but so we have some information that will be available on that soon. And actually, I'd be really interested in what comes out of this if people are looking to put together lists of functionalities that they think are most important and working with the vendors as well as the museums. That'd be great.
Perfect, there'll be a call later. So panel, any responses to any of these questions?
I would just echo the sort of emotional response that I've heard. Starting as a museum technologist 15 years ago, I never would have imagined that in 2018 we're still using the same systems that I started out with. I was disappointed with them when I started. And the opportunities are amazing, I think. And that's why I love Nik bringing this panel together. I love this group being in the room. I would love to expand the conversation beyond collections professionals, because it is, I think the vision can include every department having a view into our collections, every department seeing collections in a new way, having access to it, opening it up to the public in a new way. These are all things that are available to us. And I think, the opportunity we have is one of imagining, is one of looking to the future and saying, if we don't do anything, we're gonna be in this position in 15 years.
Just really quickly, one of the things that, and this sounds really familiar to me because I remember saying this years ago, and I'm looking right here at you because I love what you're saying, where can I find this information? And why are we still talking about this? What we're looking at, what we're anticipating is whatever do we decide to do now, it's gonna be a stepping stone for what comes next. And it won't be a stepping stone that's like 10 years from now. What is it, we need to position ourselves, we need to know this going in, like what is it, we don't know what 3 years is gonna be. So can we get those more shorter time periods of like what comes next? So we're looking for something, a product and a vendor that's really agile to get us to the next stone, I would say.
So let me ask on the vendor side, presumably you're all familiar with Spectrum. How many of you are Spectrum compliant? Anybody not Spectrum compliant? Okay. So this is a good starting point. There was a hand up.
So I'm relatively new to the museum space. I come from digital libraries, digital research libraries and archives, and what I'm about to say is perhaps a bit controversial, especially with vendors in the room, so I promise I ask this in the spirit of openness and just putting it all out on the table, which is that, in archives and in certain respects digital libraries, the move has been almost entirely to open source. And really community-driven development and support around digital content management systems, and particularly around information management systems, finding aid systems, that kind of thing. Archive space being a prime example, which is now vendor-provided through Lyrasis, in addition to being where the code itself is open source. And honestly, from my experience, that's almost, the cult of that is almost to a fault, so I'm not necessarily endorsing that, but I just thought it's kind of worth mentioning, and I would just ask the room whether there is interest. There is collection space out of UC Berkeley, and to my understanding is, that hasn't had quite the same level of uptake in museums. I'm just curious why, and whether there's a drive there at all.
So the whole study that we did was exactly for that reason, to figure out, what is going on in the community. From Lyrasis' standpoint, to have this open source product in the library community, is that what is required in the museum community? Christiane, you had your hand up.
Another vendor perspective, but to me, I really resonate what you just said, which is what, compared to 15 years ago or 20 years ago, how do you see your museum? it's not a silo anymore, where the collection is just the prerogative of one department. The collection is the centerpiece. Otherwise, it's like, metaphorically, if all of your collection, the physical one, the one in the museum, is in one room, and all of your visitors have to go there, but your entire space is around your collection and the way you share it, what you do with it. So having this, buying a collections management system that only does collections management seems to be a bit of a thing of the past, because that collection needs to go out a lot more. So it needs a lot more openness, if you want. Whether that's open source or proprietary, there's value, in my opinion, there's value in both, because open source, if you have the ability and resources to do it internally, it's a great thing, if you want. But vendors come with, Gallery System has been in this space for 25 years. Vetcom has been in the space for 20 years. We've been in the space for 15 years. So it comes with knowledge. It's not just the solution that we sell. We actually bring something to the table which I believe has value. And we need to make a living at the end of the day. Thank you.
When we first implemented our collections management system, we didn't have a website, we didn't have a digital asset management system, we didn't have a task management system. But over the 20 years since we've had our collections management system, all these expectations have been put on our system, and it wasn't originally designed like that. You know, a lot of developers complain about our system because it's so hard to get data out, and I always remind them, it's first and foremost a collections management system. It doesn't exist to put data online. It's for us to manage our collection, to do inventory, to do cataloging. But we have so many needs because of digital. We're working with third parties, but that's not what originally collections management systems were designed to do.
So we have about 5 minutes left. I want to kind of focus on the last couple of questions about it. So we talked about CHIN, resource there. We talked about Spectrum and standards compliance that gives you some kind of insight into the product without actually having to review it. Is there interest in the vendor community and the museum community of figuring out how to all come together to chart where collections management is going with a view to, you know, figuring out how to reduce the frustration, maybe better understanding at least between, you know, these two factions, and really work to, we've got to figure it out. You know, this is the, like I started off with, this is the core thing that we do, it's why we're all here.
So I don't think that's actually a problem. All of the vendors, they have hundreds of clients. They have, like Cristiano said, 20 years or more experience. So we talk to our clients all the time. We know very, very, very precisely what they need now and what's the next upcoming thing. And we try to implement it. But the one thing, and this might be like another discussion another time, Rob mentioned this like 25 minutes ago, the relation between the expectations and the available budget is something I find sometimes really, really a problem. And this is something the museum side has to learn as well. Try to ask reasonably within the means of their available budget if they do an RFP, for example. But I don't see a problem. Also, the question we had in the very beginning, different languages, like 10 different museums ask us the same thing, but in a very different language. They formulate their requirements very different. Not a problem at all, because we understand them and we can level it and we match the different requirements and find out that actually it's the exact same requirement. So some of the problems don't exist, I think.
Okay, that doesn't understand why half the people want to move from their current collections management system. I mean, I totally get what you're saying, but something is going on if half the people we talk to say we're not happy with what we've got. So either there's a disconnect between the conversation that they're having with you, or they want.
Right, they can move. Is there any reason they can't move?
You get back to the pain of. So again, it's a connected thing. They're saying, half of them are saying we don't want to use the system that we have right now. We want to go to a new one. but they're saying we can't get the resources to do it because we think it's going to be beyond our ability. So they are, many of them are saying the perceived pain of switching is more than the pain of dealing with the system that we have right now. So they do not have, so they get this hostage situation.
What do you think is the solution? They have to find the budget and the time to do it, and then it's done.
Yeah, well, an intersecting factor. Oh, sorry.
My experience, there's a little bit of a flow in that approach in wanting to change the system for another system. The flow is that you are driven by the vendor, and that shouldn't happen. There should be a partnership with your vendor, wherever you choose to trust, to say, what do you really need? How do you work? Because a lot of people come to us and say, how does your system work? And my question to them, how do you work? Because it's more important that we understand how you work, so we can tell you how we can actually configure the system to work around the way you work, instead of us telling you how you should work. And then that might work for the first generation of users, but as we know, the pain of change is a pain. So you're gonna have that system 15 years. And as in your survey, the people that have selected those systems 15 years ago have now left. So everyone else comes on board and says, but this is not the way we work. And so that doesn't work. So they want to change. And they go to the next mistake, which is not analyzing the way they work. And buying another piece of software, thinking that technology is the solution. To me, technology is a part of the solution. But it's actually doing our homework, which is to understand our collection works this way, our exhibition processes work this way, our loan process works this way. Can you do it? Can't you? Can you show me? I think the fundamental, and a good RFP and a good selection process should really challenge.
Right, and so that was one of the survey findings, was less than a quarter are actually doing any kind of formal process to select an RFP. So, so Norbert, I wouldn't be standing here if primarily there is a problem if people want to move. Maybe the issue isn't that the product doesn't have the functionality, there is something else going on. Doesn't matter, we still got to figure it out. So the framework has to be, Karen, Janet, sorry. The issue is, how do we figure out this framework to align this? Ladies and gentlemen, Janet Carding.
Thank you, Nick. It's a great session. I'm just listening to all of these comments about how people know what you want and what you think you want. And I guess for me, I'm picking up on what you're saying, Nick, and it feels like a collection management system is a fundamental building block for a museum, and as such, a change of a collection management system would be a major strategic project that you would expect to change the culture of an organisation. So I think it's really hard to ask an organisation what they want to do, because the better question would be to ask them what strategically they want to become, and then try and build a system around that, because otherwise, I think what we're hearing a lot about is that systems have been built around previous strategies, and they've existed for a long time, and there's now a mismatch between what the organisation is trying to do and what the system was set up to do. And so I guess I was just thinking then, picking up on the previous speaker, that part of the conversation has to be about seeing this as something which is going to change the organisation and allow for that, and actually try and specify it on that basis.
And we all know museums don't like change. I'm going to hand it back to the panel now. We're pretty much out of time, so some final comments.
Sure. Picking up on the last comment, I would also just add that I think this environment of change transcends individual institutions as well, and part of this perennial sense that nobody has the system that does the things they wish it could do right now is because these systems are continually tasked with functioning within continually evolving environments of opportunity and expectation. And that in that sense, since they do take time to build out and test and deploy, I would think that to some degree there always will be this gap between what we wish our current system or some other system out there could do for us, that probably at that moment no system may be quite yet able to do. And that some piece of that may just be an environmental fact, not so much something where there would actually be the perfect solution that if we had infinite resources in-house, we could just deploy, migrate to, and then it would do everything we want. I think that is likely to always be a little bit downstream and a work in process.
Any final thoughts from the panel?
Art has demands.
So before that, we clearly have to figure this out, whichever way it is. I have somewhat of a plan in my head. If you are interested, whether you're a vendor or a museum, in helping me figure this out, call me. And I'll leave you with I saw a vendor presentation yesterday, NetX, who had this fabulous mission statement and their guiding principle for their product. The collaborative process of simplicity. We can fix this. We just got to start having this conversation right now. Thank you very much for your time.
You never know. Not that it's about yeah, that's right. Yeah, I almost went to that website. You know, I suspect it's
Yes.
I think something that sort of
Yes. Yeah. We're giving a project update. Even in this group, we're showing everyone who wants to share our data and see different ways that it can flow and different potential. So from my point of view, it's just so frustrating. Still in this model. Closed networks. It's really, I feel like there's they changed 10 years ago. And so there's so
Yeah, but it relies on a very different approach to